totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. Subscribe and give the podcast a 5-star review wherever you listen. The website, bookedonrock.com. Richard Butterworth is our guest to talk about his book, Pink Floyd, Every Album, Every Song. Pink Floyd, one of the most innovative, enduringly successful bands in history. Their influence is incalculable. 1973's Dark Side of the Moon, though far from the first concept album, established a new model for quasi-symphonic, long-form investigations into the human condition. A record of thoughtfully poignant lyrics and some of the most elegant, powerful, genre-defining rock music ever made. Formed in 1967, Roger Waters, Rick Wright, and Nick Mason, helmed by the tragically brilliant Syd Barrett, fused English pastoral whimsy with electrifying instrumental voyages through inner and outer space. Their gigs at underground clubs, such as UFO and Middle Earth, are the stuff of psychedelic legend. Between 1968 and 1971, Barrett replaced by David Gilmour, their sonic inquiries were never braver. Some delivered instantly, others revealed their treasures slowly. All played crucially distinctive parts in rock's development. During the 1970s, the music matured as the messages darkened. While Floyd continued to prove that emotional weight and cathartic release can be forged from deceptively modest arrangements, the band's live spectaculars reached a pitch of technical complexity and extravagance none has matched. With insightful analysis, objectivity, and ironic wit, Richard Butterworth appraises afresh Pink Floyd's official recorded canon, from Arnold Layne to the Endless River. To hear the songs we discuss in this episode, head over to the show notes page. Richard, welcome to the Booked on Rock podcast.
Thank you so much, Eric.
Pink Floyd's catalog, it's not one where you can just shuffle them up, pick an album, and say, yeah, that's the Pink Floyd I know. You've got the early psychedelic, experimental, avant-garde years with Syd Barrett. Then you have the years when Syd is out and David Gilmour is in, and the band is trying to find their own sound with Roger Waters and David as the two main songwriters. And then you have the classic Pink Floyd, most commercially successful sound. You got Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, The Wall. But then again, we transition into the post-Roger Waters years with the David Gilmour-led albums, Momentary Lapse of Reason and The Division Bell. Similar to the Pink Floyd formula of the past, but still not the same without Roger's vocals, lyrics, and direction. So let's get to all of that, but we'll start in the beginning. The first two singles from Pink Floyd, Arnold Layne and See Emily Play from 1967. Arnold Layne, number 20 in the UK. See Emily Play goes top 10, number 6 single. So who makes up Pink Floyd at this time? And can you talk about the inner workings of the band? Because Syd Barrett is essentially the leader.
Well, he is. He's pretty much been the band leader since Floyd's inception in 1965. There had been iterations of the band members prior to that, since about 1963, but in various different guises. But the Pink Floyd sound, which was what they were first called, came into being in 1965 when famously Syd got hold of the names of two bluesmen, Pink Anderson and Floyd Council, and botched the two together because they were all big blues fans at the stage. And the Pink Floyd, and in fact, it was the Pink Floyd in those days, and the Pink Floyd was born. And yes, Syd was very much the governor. He was easily the focal point on stage. He was by far the most charismatic of the four at the time. There he was with Rick Wright, Roger Waters, and Nick Mason at this stage. And the other members of the band almost looked like journeymen. They could have been their own road crew. Syd was the guy with the magnetism. He was a good-looking guy. He was a bit of a babe magnet, and he was the man you felt had the vision to do all this sort of making these sonic sculptures, these crazed 20-minute instrumentals on stage in places like the UFO, which became they had a residence at the UFO Club in Tottenham Court Road in 1967, and it was really Syd's vision. But Syd's not only this keen sonic tourist, if you like, and always ready to find out what might happen musically if they all started off playing a relatively simple 2-chord theme, and let's see where it goes from there. So he was great at that radical musical experimentation. personified by the likes of Interstellar Overdrive and Astronomy Domini and a number of other pieces. But he also had the knack of writing a great pop song, which was, now that's an interesting circle to square, really, because not many could do that. And it certainly became the case when Sid left the band. You know, he was highly literate. He was very closely in touch with that sort of 1967 zeitgeist, which was built on the works of great fantasy writers. So if you think how much pop music was based on the writings of Kenneth Graham and Tolkien, A.A. Milne, Lewis Carroll, and so forth. And Sid was right in there with that stuff. And those writers really did inform his own writing. So when he was writing words, he was writing these glorious, whimsical English chunks of psychedelia. And of course, two of those became the first two great singles.
Interesting phrasing, too, the way he wrote those songs. It's really clever wordplay. I mean, fantastic, and there's something effortless about it. Sometimes it's almost conversation, and yet there's something incredibly poetic about it. I can't think many writers who actually were able to do that. And at some point, the problem was with Sid that the other part of Sid's makeup at this time was the demon LSD. And he'd just been doing so much of it since about 1965, which I think is when he first dropped acid. But by 1967, it's getting the better of him because he was a very, very brilliant musician, a very, very brilliant man, and a very fragile psyche. To be doing dope as potentially dangerous as LSD. You know, I mean, Peter Green was another famous acid casualty, if you like, but Sid's probably the most famous of all, or infamous. I mean, it was very, very sad. Anyway, his abilities as a band leader started to wane on that basis. And that, I think, included his songwriting, because although I would say that Arnold Layne and C.M. Clay are quite brilliant, and his songs on the first Floyd album, Pipe at Gates of Dawn, are marvellous. But when you think about his singles that he was writing for Floyd after C.M. Clay, the third one, for example, which was Apples and Oranges, it didn't hit it. There was something wrong with it. It just wasn't there. I think Roger Waters quite liked it, but it just didn't get it. It wasn't anywhere near. It didn't hit the mark that the previous two had done. And by this time, Sid is beginning to look something of a liability because his behaviour, because of the drugs, was becoming more and more erratic, more and more unpredictable. So, you know, things were looking a bit shaky for the band for a while. You know, Peter Jenner and Andrew King, who were the band's managers of Black Enterprises, were very much. They were on Team Sid very, very much, and they believed that Sid should stick around. Meanwhile, the rest of the band were kind of getting the brunt of it on stage because they'd be on stage with Sid, and Sid would be just out of it and incapable of doing anything. So at that point, they all started, you know, looking around and reasoned that they probably had enough kind of creative juices in their tank to manage without Sid. And of course, as it proved, once Dave Gilmour came on the scene, then it was the creativity became quite formidable. But you know, there was this sort of worrying moment that you know, Sid started looking too difficult to work with. Well, Norman Smith produced that album, The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, which is the debut Pink Floyd album, and he talked about the difficulties he had working with a band, and that had to do with Sid. What did he have to say about that experience?
Well, in his own words, he said that working with Sid was hell, and that he took no good things from it, which I don't know. He didn't have much to say about the rest of the band either. He didn't think Roger Waters was a particularly good bass player. Although I think Roger would probably concur at that time, he probably wasn't that good a bass player. He wasn't technically a great musician. Neither really was Nick Mason. At that stage, they were feeling their way into their instrumentation. Rick Wright was a brilliant musician. He was gifted. He'd been classically trained in all sorts of things. But, you know, he didn't escape Norman's barbs. Norman reckoned he was quietly arrogant. And you reckon that Nick Mason was just along for the ride, which is... may have been true as long as the ride was a Ferrari or something.
Yeah.
No. But, you know, Norman said all these things. It seemed uncharacteristic of him to have even said them in the first place. because he was ever the professional, Norman Smith. He was a company man. He was an EMI staff producer. He produced lots of other artists for EMI, including the Beatles. So it seemed a little unprofessional that he should making these opinions of people he was going to work with again, because there were more Floyd albums to be made, and more Floyd albums which would have Norman at the desk.
Now, this was released in August of 1967, by the way, this album. Next is A Saucer Full of Secrets, released June 1968, and it's got Remember a Day, one of my favorite early era Pink Floyd songs, sung by Richard Wright. Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun is on this album. So Sid, by this time, his mental state is, it's not good, right? Where is he at this point? Because you write that he is still seen as a valuable asset as a songwriter. That's in your book.
Well, yes, I think the band had a kind of, they grudgingly, they knew that Sid was at heart a great songwriter. And he still had the backing of Black Hill Enterprises. But because Sid's behaviour on stage in particular had become so erratic that by the beginning of 1968, the band had virtually decided that they were going to have to go on without it. And they hired David Gilmour, who was an old pal from Cambridge. David came in, and there was this very strange short period, a matter of weeks, where there was a five-piece Floyd. David Gilmour was almost mimicking Sid's guitar style on stage. Sid would be there, and he'd have his mirrored Telecaster, or Fender Esquire, wasn't it? His mirrored Esquire guitar around his neck, and he'd be just sort of wandering rather aimlessly around the stage while Gilmour was picking up on Sid's guitar parts. So it must have been quite a weird, discombobulating experience to see that edition of Floyd in those few moments at the beginning of 1968.
There was a story that I remember hearing about a TV appearance where every time the cameras went on, Sid wouldn't do anything, just stared blankly. And then they turn the cameras off and say, "Hey, Sid, you got to do something here." He said, "Oh, no, okay, I got it.
That's right.
Let's do it." Oh, that's, yeah.
It was the Top of the Pops,
yes,
which was the biggest pop show in this country at the time. And that's where the exposure lay. Again, there were these... Sid sent out he did send out weird, strange, conflicting messages. There was part of him that wanted to be a pop star. But at the same time, he wasn't kind of allowing it to happen by just being incredibly difficult on, the country's biggest medium for broadcast pop music of the lot. So yes,
and then they turn he'd say, "Oh, I got it. Don't worry, you can turn the cameras on. I got it."
Yeah,
turn the cameras on. It's like he's messing with them.
So, exactly.
Eventually, Sid's no longer a band member by the time they record music from the film More. That's released in the summer of 1969. As you write, this is really a transition album. It doesn't feel like an official studio album. And then you have 1969's Umaguma, which is a mix of live recordings and solo compositions from each band member. The title, by the way, supposedly Cambridge slang for sex.
Yes.
Just in case you're wondering.
So they say. I don't think I've ever heard it in any other context but that album. But there you go. Yes, I think. I'm a gunner. I think it's one of the most underrated rock albums in history, and it's been unfairly trashed by Pink Floyd, to my mind. Goodness me, they have every right. They're the artists. They're the creators. They created the music. They have every entitlement to be their own sternest critics. And one has to respect that. But then, you could step back and say, well, maybe they're just a little bit too close to it. Maybe their levels of perfectionism are such that they don't allow a failed experiment into their overall modus operandi, if you like.
But they felt the same way about that next album, right? Atom Heart Mother.
Atom Heart Mother, they hated with a vengeance. They really did.
But it's their first number one in the UK. And
absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, what's your take on the album?
On Atom Heart Mother, I think it's great. I maybe not one of the very best, but it might well have been a failed experiment, but it was a brave experiment. And the thing was that there were very, very few rock bands in the world doing what Floyd were doing at that period. And really, it's that period between Sid's departure and David Gilmour's arrival, and threading through to the early 70s to metal, for example. They were incredibly adventurous. in this period. They were doing stuff that, I mean, I can name a handful of bands that were probably as advanced as them. Frank Zappa's Mothers of Invention, for example. Probably the Grateful Dead when they were straight enough. Probably Airplane. And after that, well, the Velvet Underground, who were doing they were adding, the avant-garde to punk, basically. But there was this handful of groups in the world that were getting around, and also some of the German bands like Can and Arnold Layne. But there weren't that many, and certainly Floyd were more adventurous during that period than they ever were again. So, yes, they were experimenting. They were doing things like The Man, the Journey on stage, which was this conceptual threading together of 7 or 8 ordinary, if you like, songs. Careful with Axe Eugene and Cymbeline and Green is the Colour and so forth, and Sorcerer of Secrets and so forth. Threading them together with a lot of sort of musique concrète, pushing these tracks together, and they would do things like saw wood on stage and make pots of tea and all this kind of strangely impromptu stuff just for sonic effect. And yeah, you could look back now and think, well, I mean, okay, we are talking about failed experimentation, perhaps, but hell, they were doing it, and not many people were. Now, if Rick Wright, for example, felt that, say, Sisyphus he might have felt it was a failed experiment. I don't think it failed. I think it's one of the most stupendous 14 minutes of rock music ever made. That's a fantastic piece of music. So they were making some wonderful stuff, and I think the whole of Ummagumma is absolutely brilliant. The 2 sides of Great Live, which was a sort of State of the Union address, if you like, by Pink Floyd at that point. This is where we're at live. So there were 4 of their anthemic live songs, which were, if I remember correctly, Astronomy Domini, Set the Controls for Half of the Sun, Careful with Axe Eugene, and Sorcerer of Secrets.
Yeah,
so that's the live part.
They
brought then you've got the studio stuff where they just go way, way beyond anything anybody else was doing elsewhere. It's great.
Then they brought out Astronomy Domini on the Pulse tour in '94, which I thought was really cool.
Yeah, it stood the test of time. Yeah.
Now, it's interesting. There's a track off of 1971's Metal called Fearless, and that's pretty much how you could describe Pink Floyd. I mean, they're fearless at that point. Like you say, they're going to try whatever, and they're going to experiment. Mm-hmm. But then we start to hear the signs of what would become the classic Pink Floyd sound on Metal. One of these days in Echoes. And David Gilmour later said, you quote him in your book, this album was a clear forerunner for Dark Side of the Moon, the point when we first got our focus. Now, it was. Yeah, and you say Echoes is one of Pink Floyd's greatest achievements.
Oh, I think Echoes is stupendous.
Talk about that song. How does it come together, and what are we hearing on this track? Because Rick Wright's got some really interesting effects on his piano.
Well, it all started off with, as so much Floyd music does, it started off with a lot of fragmentary bits and pieces that they'd been putting together in the studio, and they actually managed to knock together into a vaguely roadworthy live piece, which they called at that time, the brilliant Floyd grasp of branding, they called it Nothing Parts 1 to 24, which was basically 24 of these disparate fragments of music that they'd been messing around with and, cutting up tapes and doing all sorts of strange things in the studio. They got it on tour, and they started, I think they did, there was a live gig that they played at one of the universities in East Anglia or somewhere, and I think that might have been April 1971, is that about right? Anyway, they taped this at a live concert and took that back, and that became the basis of what would eventually become Echoes. So, as always with Floyd, there's this kind of starting off from the bare bones of strange, disparate slices of this, that, and the other, and you wonder at that point, how is this going to come together? But by some alchemy in the studio and on tour, they get it to come together. And then the sort of, if you like, the pièce de résistance of Echoes was that one note which Rick Wright played on his piano. It went through a Leslie speaker. Now, Rick has said, or he did say that it was his idea. Roger Waters also claimed it was his idea, but here we go. Anyway, the idea was that you put this one piano note through a rotating Leslie speaker, and you got this, if you like, a sonar effect. It's a bit like the kind of Aztec, the submarine hunter killer thing. And it sounded so good that they just used it to effectively top and tail the whole piece. And the result is this stupendous piece of music. It was really Floyd becoming, David Gilmour's right, it was Floyd becoming more mature in its approach. Whereas before they'd take a song like Souls Full of Secrets, and it was like jumping into this black hole. There's extraordinary stuff that was coming out of it, and it was amazing. I mean, I saw Floyd several times during that time, during 1969, 1970. And sometimes they'd play Sourceful for 20 minutes or more, and it was an incredible experience. But then again, was it always? Didn't always work, because that was the nature of the music. It was highly serendipitous when it did work, but, maybe it didn't always. They'd matured by now, and they were getting it right. And it was a beautiful, beautiful piece of music.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. You could ask somebody, what album came before Dark Side of the Moon? And I wonder how many people would even know. I mean, it's
would
an
say
album.
Obscured by Clouds.
Yeah. And a lot of people forget about that one. It includes the single Free 4. Is the band, are they still trying out new approaches here? You refer to the music as being counterintuitive impulse.
Yeah, I think they were falling asleep. You've got to remember they were on a brief from a movie director, just like Moore. It was the same director, in fact, Harvey Schroeder. Now, he had his own take on what he wanted Floyd to do musically for his movies. And his thing was to have this, what they call diegetic source music, which is where instead of using Floyd as they should have been used, which was as this, if you like, an emotional overlay to the visuals. And, if you can imagine, easy to imagine, a Floyd soundscape overlaid to lovely visuals of a rainforest, an aerial shot of, Papua New Guinea or what have you. You can see, you can feel your short hairs rising when you're sitting in that cinema seat. And that's how Floyd should have been used in these movies. Not a bit of it. Schroeder wanted their music to be trickling out of transistor radios or car stereos, just as sort of incidental smidgens. So I don't know if that's why they just went ahead and wrote these rather bland 3 or 4 minute folk rock ditties, because that's what they sound like. It's a subjective viewpoint, I admit that. For me, it was counterintuitive to Floyd, because I suppose I loved Floyd so much at that time, I'd become so used to the kind of music they played generally, and I'd become used to them surprising me. And suddenly there were songs like, some of the things on Obscured by Clouds that absolutely far from surprisingly just made me run a mile. I thought folk rock is not Pink Floyd. They might as well be. It's a bit like asking the band to finish their sets with Source Full of Secrets. It's not a good look. The band were magnificent. Lots of other folk rock bands, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, Grateful Dead when they turned to acoustic music in 1970 with Working Man's Dead. Lovely stuff. And there was a movement toward that kind of rustic simplicity in rock music, I think, at that time. Floyd perhaps picked up on that wrongly, to my mind, and made a couple of out. Well, there was really, as evidenced by Obscured by Clouds and by the first side, or part of the first side of Medal, I think it was a mistake.
But what follows is one of the most impressive, legendary runs in rock history, starting with Dark Side of the Moon, released March 1st, 1973. Time, Money, Us and Them, start to finish. It's a brilliant piece of music.
Thank heavens they got the folk rock out of their system.
They got it. Yeah. You have a great quote from Roger Waters in this chapter. What did he have to say about the overall meaning and concept of Dark Side of the Moon?
Well, or at least we've got his word for it. It had nothing to do with the Wizard of Oz, because that one was being peddled around for a long time, wasn't it?
Urban legend.
Yeah. Well, okay, you've heard it here first, folks. Roger Waters says it was nothing to do with the Wizard of Oz. Thank heavens. Yeah, Roger saw it was empathy. Was if you could condense the whole of Dark Side of the Moon into a single expression, a single one-word meaning, it's empathy. Well, that's how Roger Waters saw it. He had that. There was that. I think there's the line that you mentioned that I quoted in the book, where Roger says, "quote The line I'll see you on the side of the dark side of the moon is me speaking to the listener, saying, I know you have had these bad feelings and impulses because I do too, and one of the ways I can make contact with you is to share the fact that I feel bad sometimes as well." I think Roger's idea basically was to question a number of phases and pressures of a person's life. And this he was basing on his and Floyd's own experiences as a successful rock band, and also relating to the mental problems of Syd Barrett. So we've got conflict, we've got the pace of modern life, there's the passing of time, there's religion, avariciousness, madness, death. And Roger saw everyday life as a series of little battles between the positive and the negative, and with the overall notion of the importance of empathy. I think he means that the overall conflict and dysfunction that blight the human condition can only be overcome if people actually start recognizing what he called this single elemental characteristic that everyone shares, as he put it, which is basically understanding each other's plight and then responding empathetically and positively, not negatively. So I think that was his take on his own work. Needless to say, it's been picked apart by everybody and his mother. When I was writing the book, obviously I did a lot of research, and you end up in some very strange places on the internet, and there's some quite extraordinary theories being peddled about all sorts of things on there, of course. But I think Roger's explanation is it kind of feels about right. He was. It's all sort of. It sounds a bit hippy dippy-ish, but 50 years on, the world, we're in this sort of morass of social media and still perpetually in conflict. Then it all seems like a tougher call than ever. But it felt tied to its times in the early 1970s. The whole hippie thing was not long gone. I think people still felt quite idealistic, and I think there is that idealism thing that's going on with Dark Side of the Moon. 50 years on, it feels as if it could have been recorded yesterday. How many albums, especially big production albums of that period, can you say that about? And very few. But Dark Side of the Moon it's talking about universal truths. I mean, I'm not going to say, I'm not going to compare Roger Waters with Shakespeare because that's pretentious nonsense. But if you know what I mean, if the great writers of the ages were addressing universal truths in their work, then Roger can probably sort of hold his head fairly high among that company. I think.
Absolutely. And we cannot go without mentioning Hypnosis and Storm Thorgerson, the classic album cover design on Dark Side of the Moon. And he did the covers for all of the previous Floyd albums. And he would outdo himself on the next one, 1975's Wish You Were Here. Two businessmen shaking hands, one on fire, inspired by the idea that people tend to conceal their true feelings for fear of getting burned. Brilliant. While Dark Side of the Moon was inspired by Syd Barrett's mental decline, so was Wish You Were Here, and Syd shows up out of the blue one day while the band is recording the album. What happened?
Well, it's often wonder these days whether it's a bit of an urban myth, but it did happen according to the band.
And there's a picture of it, right? Because Nick Mason had it in his book.
Well, he did, absolutely. And he said in his book that everybody's got a different version of the story. His take, and I think probably Nick's word, I think we can take his word for it. There's no side. I never got the feeling there's any side to Nick Mason. That I'm sure that what he said, what he remembers, is right. But basically, Syd turned up unannounced at the Wish You Were Here sessions, and the remarkable thing being, now this is something that Nick Mason's not absolutely certain of, but apparently they were playing "Shine On You Crazy Diamond" at the time, which is one of Roger Waters' greatest lyrics to Syd, in fact. But according to Nick, this might not be true, but he can't remember for certain. But apparently they saw this, vacant-looking, bald, fat guy hanging around at the back of the studio wearing an old Mac and carrying a shopping bag, and wondered at first who on earth it was. And then when the penny dropped, they kind of had this very strange, stilted conversation. They offered to play Syd back what they'd just been playing, and he said, "No, it's all right. I've heard it once. That's enough." And then Syd apparently started talking about his shopping and lamb chops and very, very strange stuff. It's almost caricature acid casualty Syd. It's very, very weird. But it left everybody, and then he just kind of disappeared into the St. John's Wood traffic, and that was that. Apparently, he and again uncorroborated, but he may or may not have turned up at David Gilmour's wedding, which was a couple of days later.
Oh wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so it was said, but Gilmore hasn't been that much forthcoming about that. So again, that might have been, might be hearsay. Who knows?
I heard he was brushing his teeth in the studio. Again,
it was
eyebrows were shaved.
He possibly. Apparently he just sort of left the studio, but he was spotted kind of hanging around outside the studio, sort of shuffling from one foot to the other, and perhaps waiting for a lift. Perhaps, I don't know. But apparently Phil Taylor, who was one of Floyd's roadies, was leaving at that time. He was leaving the studios. He deliberately ducked his head in the car so that Sid wouldn't see him, because he dreaded actually having to become the threat of becoming a captive audience to this, very strange man. Desperately sad. Actually, never seen again by the band. He was seen. He was living in Cambridge with his mother, and certain reporters would track him down at his mother's house, and he would give them short shrift, and that was that.
I remember when the internet came along in the 90s, you'd see websites where there are pictures of Sid. He's taking out the trash.
Yeah.
Riding his bike. He would ride his bike downtown to go to the art
right.
store. And he just wanted to be left alone. Now, I also heard stories about the publishing checks would arrive at his house for Pink Floyd music, and he would throw them out. I heard that. And people would knock on his door and wanting to talk to him. And sometimes he would chat. Sometimes he would just open the door and shut it. But like Roger said, a lot of people glamorized the whole thing, but it was sad. And this was a friend. This was somebody they cared about. The album, Wish You Were Here, it's as good as it gets. Shine on You Crazy Diamond, Welcome to the Machine, Have a Cigar, the title track, and then it finishes with Shine on You Crazy Diamond. And then Animals follows in 1977, and this is such an interesting album in that it's often forgotten simply because there are no singles. 3 songs, the 17-minute Dogs, the 11-minute Pigs, 3 different ones, and the 10-minute Sheep in between the minute-and-a-half acoustic tracks titled Pigs on the Wing.
It's a stupendous record. It really is one of my absolute favorite Floyd albums.
I'm with you on that one. What's the concept of it?
It's the most political Pink Floyd album to date. I think it's Roger Waters, again being the creative impetus behind the whole album, seems to be leaving behind this deep-rooted personal psychological angst with which Dark Side of the Moon and Wish You Were Here were imbued, for a commentary about the various archetypes who are carving up society for their own gain. Bankers, rapacious business people, politicians like Margaret Thatcher, who doesn't exactly come away smelling of roses on this record. There's the religious right, personified by Mary Whitehouse, who was, I don't know how well known Mary Whitehouse was in the States, but you could equate her to Marjorie Taylor Greene would be probably a pretty good equivalent of Mary Whitehouse, only Whitehouse wasn't a politician. But she personified the religious right, this kind of terribly buttoned up, puritanical, always on the look. She saw herself as a watchdog for conservative standards. Actually, she was basically a busybody, but anyway, she's one of the targets of Animals. So all these archetypes are reimagined as the Animals, the title. Now, in that respect, it's easy to compare the album's narrative with Orwell's Animal Farm, but that's not quite right. Orwell was lampooning Soviet communism, but Waters very much has his sights on Britain and this looming dystopia, which he was certain was coming, and probably still is. We're probably a bit closer to it now than we were then. But in the end, you have the dogs, the pigs, and the sheep. The dogs and the pigs are the kind of overlords. They're a sort of mix of the politicians. I think the politicians are the pigs and the dogs are the business people. And they conspire to tread down the sheep. But then the sheep eventually rise up and bite back. And, it's left to our own conjecture, really, what happens then, because there's not going to be, under those circumstances, in reality, you've got dystopia. There's not going to be any happy ending. You can have one strata of society biting back at another. I think it's a human inevitability that whenever a despotic regime is overturned, another is going to rise to take its place. Now, maybe Waters feels the same way, but there's no quick and easy answers. If you've got chaos, out of chaos rises a very strong leader, and it all starts over. There is no utopia down the road. It's dystopia or nothing, folks. It's pretty grim stuff.
Yeah, grim and fascinating though at the same time.
Oh, it is, and there is, there is still that release, which is something I think about. This is probably where David Gilmour comes into his own, of this instinct for creating music that builds amazing tension, and then releasing it right at the right moment at the end. For example, at the end of Sheep, after 10 minutes of build-up, you've got this stupendous Gilmour guitar, this descending guitar motive of David Gilmour's, which is one of the great moments in rock music.
Phenomenal.
It's truly magnificent stuff, and he does that time and time again throughout Pink Floyd's career. He did it with Comfortably Numb. He does it with Shine On. He does it so often. He's the king of feel. He's the king of feel.
Absolutely. Author Richard Butterworth, our guest. His brand new book, Pink Floyd, Every Album, Every Song. It's out now. Now imagine releasing two brilliant, hugely commercially successful albums like Dark Side of the Moon and Wish You Were Here, and still have one more left in the tank. The Wall, released in 1979, Another Brick in the Wall Part 2, Run Like Hell, Comfortably Numb, as you just mentioned. They lead this double album, which is the best-selling double album of all time, the second best-selling Pink Floyd album behind Dark Side of the Moon. Can you talk about the two ideas that Roger Waters brought to the table on this one? Because one piece of music ends up being the future solo project, The Pros and Cons of Hitchhiking, but the other becomes what ends up becoming The Wall. So what's the inspiration behind The Wall? There's a connection to the band's previous tour, right? And then some personal...
Yes. It's arguably The Wall. What sparked The Wall was a rather indelicate instance during the In the Flesh tour in 1977, when I think Floyd were playing in a stadium in Montreal, and there were about 80,000 in the audience, and the audience were just going bananas. And Waters had been concerned about this for some time, because he felt that the band was becoming more and more remote from its audience, because he certainly did have a slightly sort of bit of froideur, really. He had it has to be said, a contempt for a lot of the audiences of Pink Floyd, because he once upon a time, as David Gilmour once put it, you could go to a Floyd gig and you could hear a pin drop. Not anymore. Those days are long gone. You could argue that the sort of the populism that was generated by huge hits like Money and One of These Days, everybody wanted, all the kids just wanted to go to a big stadium. They just wanted to dance. In a sense, they were using a Floyd show as a giant stadium-sized aerobics class, because all they wanted to do was get on down and boogie. And Floyd were never really about that, but, like it or not, that's what was going on. So Rogers lost his wig with this one guy, and he spits in his face. And he wasn't particularly proud of the fact afterwards, but, he kind of got him thinking more and more about the alienation between band and fans. And he started thinking about sort of the erection of a wall between the band and the crowd. So he mentions the idea of a concept album based on that idea to Bob Ezrin, who he looked up, I think it was sometime on the same tour or a bit later, looked up Bob Ezrin in New York, and they talked it through. And Ezrin said, well, look, why don't you do it? Go ahead and do it. It sounds great, So next thing we know is Bob Ezrin is summoned to Roger's place in England, and he kind of walks into this sort of very primitive 90-minute demo that Roger had worked up based on the conversations he'd had with Bob and the thoughts he was having about walls and alienation and all the rest of it. So basically, Bob helped refine it all and agreed to co-produce. But meanwhile, Roger had produced another demo, which he pitched the rest of Pink Floyd. They felt it was a bit too personal, as if The Wall isn't, but there you go.
Right.
And Roger went along with that, and it eventually basically became Roger's first solo album, Pros and Cons of Hitchhiking. So that sort of second demo is shelved for Roger's first solo album, and what he was working up with Bob Ezrin became The Wall.
Serious tension going on between Ezrin and Roger Waters. There was a story
well, I think
he showed up late, and Roger's pointing at his watch like, you're late.
Well, I think that at this point, Roger is becoming very, very difficult to work with. It's well known that everybody knows about the rift between him and David Gilmour. The rift between Waters and the rest of the band probably started with his problems with Rick Wright, or the problems that Rick Wright had with Roger. Rick felt, round about the making of Animals, that Floyd was turning into Roger Waters' backing band, and he just felt really quite cheesed off about it. By the time the war came along, he was having his own marital problems, and his heart wasn't in it. He was seen to be underperforming. Got to the stage where, Roger just said, well, that's it. Out. Basically sacked him. So, at this point, Rick Wright was not a member of Pink Floyd at this point.
Still hard to believe that even happened.
Well, exactly. I mean, I think you had to be there. I wouldn't want to speculate on the nuances of these relationships. I'm sure there's much more to it than, what we see in, speculative newspaper articles and magazine articles and even biographies. I don't think there's any doubt, having said that Roger was a difficult guy to work with. And everybody kind of found that. I think the only one who didn't have too much of a problem was Nick Mason, but he was just maybe, as Norman Smith had said, Nick was just there for the ride.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. The last Pink Floyd album to include Roger Waters is 1983's The Final Cut. Not Now John was the single. You write, quote, Pink Floyd's 12th album is a tough listen, but only if you allow it to be. I thought that was interesting. What did you mean by that?
Well, I mean that because what I meant there was that it doesn't feel like a Pink Floyd album, and it still doesn't to this day. And that is because, okay, as a Floyd fan, I would approach listening to a Pink Floyd album and expect certain things. And every Floyd album had delivered those expectations, including even things, well, not so much Obscured by Clouds or More, and let's say half of Medal. The other albums, they all delivered on what one expects of Pink Floyd. Suddenly there's this record that there's no obvious anthem. There's no screamingly emotive, yearning Gilmour soloing, or very little of it. There's a couple of things here and there. It just feels like it's not a Pink Floyd album, but it's a great Roger Waters album. Roger is clearly now the boss, absolutely in charge. And, I think that it reveals its treasures very slowly. Hard record to get into, and like I say, not an obvious Pink Floyd album in the same way its predecessors were. But that said, I like it very much now. I think it's a great album. But it's just a bit of a thumb on the hand, Pink Floyd.
Right, but it's funny. It is a Roger Waters solo album, really, when you think about it. But my favorite track is Not Now John, which is David Gilmour.
Yeah, that's which is interesting because I find that I like Not Now John, but I find that's the one track that doesn't feel as if it's part of the rest of the album. He's suddenly got different characters coming up. I mean, he's got this sort of DJ character, sort of like I kind of interpret as this sort of rather coke-addled DJ of some sort of broadcaster. It's an odd song. It doesn't seem to fit with the rest of the album somehow.
Yeah. But, what was it that Roger just said? Hey, you get one song on the album.
It might have been. It might have been something like that. Yeah.
And Roger quits in 1985. When did the problem start with Roger and the band, and what ultimately leads to his departure? I mean, that's kind of a general question. I mean, I think essentially it's about creative control, right?
I'm sure it is. And Roger is obviously, he's an alpha, isn't he? He's really quite a strong character. And I think that David Gilmour's a strong character. And I think that clash, they're both equally talented artists in their own different ways. I tell you what, I sometimes think to myself that as so often I go back to comparing things with the Beatles. You had this genius partnership of Lennon and McCartney. You split that partnership, and you've got two. Depends on your point of view. Depends on how much you like their individual contributions to music since the fall of the Beatles. But I've never had much time for McCartney's solo stuff. I don't have a lot of time for Wings. Lennon had some passingly interesting stuff. The Primal Scream stuff, the Plastic Ono Band album was terrific. But neither of them was capable of producing solo what they knew they could do together. And even though they didn't write together after about 1965 or 66, and you could you could positively identify a Lennon song from a McCartney song, they were still together in the same band and they were still batting off each other. I think once you took them apart, suddenly the music suffers. And I think that's the same with Waters and Gilmour. You know, all their best music has been made together. Who remembers Gilmour's solo albums? I mean, and who really remembers Waters' solo albums?
Right. They're good moments, but yeah, you're right.
Yeah, so Roger's this rather tough character, tough cookie. He wants to get his own way. And you had Richard Wright, who was, by all accounts, a pretty diffident sort of character, fairly quiet, just sort of wanted to get on with sort of making his own music. And he, you know, so you can imagine him working with this sort of terrifying bull-like alpha male in the studio who's sort of shouting at everybody and, you know, telling them you've got to do it this way and you've got to do it that way. And I think Rick just got ground down by it all. I mean, whether he actually suffered mental problems because of it, I don't know. There's been speculation in that respect, but I don't know.
How did you feel about David Gilmour continuing Pink Floyd without Roger Waters at the time? What was your initial thought on that?
I was a little bit ambiguous about it, really, a bit ambivalent. Again, looking at that comparison between Lennon and McCartney, I fell on the side of always floating back to Pink Floyd as I knew and loved it, rather than the later Floyd. I mean, that said, you could take something like The Momentary Lapse of Reason, which is a decent album. It's not a great album. I don't think it's a great album in the Floyd sense of things. It's very 80s. It's lots of gated reverb and compressed drums and MIDI digital stuff going on. I mean, it's very sharp and shiny and clean and possibly too much so. I think what saves it is Sorrow at the end, which is a big anthemic Floyd number, which is what we all want from Floyd. And it showed that, you know, take Waters out of the equation, David left to his own devices could still produce that kind of sound, that kind of song. But ultimately, you know, A Momentary Lapse is really just a bunch of songs. There's no unifying feel. There's no real unifying factor. There isn't a big ideas man behind it all, making it a completely cohesive album.
And didn't David present songs to the label and they said, no, this doesn't sound like Pink Floyd?
Yeah, I won't use the word that the CBS man used, but he said this doesn't sound like a Pink Floyd album. Gilmour had been messing around with a load of tapes with Bob Ezrin, who he kind of poached off. Waters wasn't very happy with Ezrin about that, by the way. Yeah. I think Waters wanted Ezrin to work with him, and Gilmour had poached him. And that probably goes back to Bob figuring it was easier to work with David Gilmour than it was to work with Roger Waters, so that may have been the reason. But anyway, so David is making these tapes with Bob Ezrin, and he's not really sure what he's going to do with them. He thinks they might go, thinking maybe a solo album, maybe another Pink Floyd album. But then along comes the man from CBS who listens to it and says, no joke, this is not Pink Floyd music, forget it. So in the end, David just agreed to sort of look at them again and work them up because he decided it was going to be Pink Floyd. You know, and that may well have been just a hard-nosed commercial decision. You know, Pink Floyd's name emblazoned across a poster sold. David Gilmour's didn't, neither did Roger Waters. Floyd was the brand. You know, it was such a massive brand that it seemed that no amount of, you know, chiseling by the various band members and their various antipathies was going to actually spoil that brand. That brand was so powerful, so strong. And I guess Gilmour figured, well, you know, I'm going with this. So he, you know, buffed them all up and, you know, to the satisfaction of CBS, and there we go.
Do we know, Richard, are those early songs that were presented to CBS, are they out there? Are they completely different songs? Are they just kind of...
I wouldn't be surprised if they're... I don't know, to tell you the truth, Eric. They might be out there somewhere. I wouldn't be surprised if they're sitting there somewhere and the Pink Floyd Music Limited is going to give us another massive compilation album, because there have been these huge, you know, you're probably familiar with the obfuscations and all that. There are about 7 or 8 box sets. I mean, about 33 discs in all covering Pink Floyd music between 1966 and 1972. And then they've since done the same thing with later Floyd. I wouldn't be surprised if they resurface at some point, but I don't know for certain.
Yeah, for an anniversary, I'm trying to think, 87, let's see, 97, 2007.
Well,
Where are we
next
at
year is there's the 50th anniversary of Dark Side of the Moon. So
yeah.
we've got 50s coming up. Several years ahead, haven't we? And it seems to me that the record companies just kind of save everything up for an anniversary release. So you get some huge reissued, remastered this 5.1 surround sound and all the rest of it.
Yep, all fancy stuff. Well, we know Momentary Lapse of Reason was commercially a success. It had Learning to Fly on there, which was a huge hit. On the Turning Away. One Slip was a single, did good. And the album reached number 3 on the charts. And, David Gilmour, he pulled it off. It's basically him and Nick Mason because Richard Wright still wasn't officially back in the band. He's listed there, like you say in the book, it's like the smaller font. It's like also Richard Wright. It's like he's there, but.
Well, yeah, I mean, it was a bit strange, really, because although Wright is kind of there, I mean, there's a very telling photograph in the inner sleeve of Momentary Lapse of Gilmour and Mason, and it's a rather cheesy David Bailey shot of the two of them.
Yeah.
And then there's the band listings, and it's David Gilmour, dolly dolly da, Nick Mason, dolly dolly da, and then all of a sudden in this markedly smaller font, you've got Rick Wright, keyboards, dolly dolly da. So Rick Wright is even now is relegated to the role of a sideman. He's just one of these session weeks, But the thing was, even Nick didn't have much to do with Momentary Lapse of Reason. He did very little.
Right.
Which was why there were these sort of hired guns like Carmine and Peachy and Jim Keltner, who were depping for Nick on drums. Nick has said that he'd sort of lost his mojo, he'd lost his confidence, he'd forgotten his drum parts. Who knows?
Well, we do hear his voice on Learning to Fly. That's cool.
Yes, we do. Yes.
In that middle part there where you hear a voice and it's somebody in the air flying, and that's Nick. That's Nick. Yeah. And the tour that follows the Momentary Lapse of Reason album is a massive undertaking, and it pulls down $135 million worldwide, highest grossing tour of the 80s. They released the live album Delicate Sound of Thunder. David Gilmour and Nick Mason do some side projects, and in January of 93, they reconvene, this time with Richard Wright officially to start work on what would be 1994's The Division Bell. And Bob Ezrin back, and so is Storm Thorgerson with another stunning album cover. By the way, before I forget that, going back to Momentary Lapse of Reason, that cover is real. That is not photo trick. I love that story about
Storm Thorgerson, he saw 200 hospital beds and spread them up this. Oh, was it 800? I think.
Yeah.
I think it was 800 hospital beds that he sought, and he strung them along 2 miles of North Devon coast. If you'd ever said to Storm, Photoshop, he probably would have hit you.
Yes. Did you have Storm's book that he put out with all those great stories in it?
I do have it. So I do have a hypnosis book. I don't know if it's exactly a Storm biography. It's a sort of large format coffee table size book on hypnosis, which just lots and lots of depictions of various Floyd album covers that Hypnosis did.
Well, there's another one that recently came out, Through the Prism, and that's with Aubrey Powell. That was Storm's partner there at Hypnosis, and that is beautiful book, put together beautifully. But so he comes back and does the cover on The Division Bell, which again, another stunning piece of art. And
well, again, you see, it wasn't going to be an illustration. He had those sculptures of those two faces, specially sculpted. They're the height of a double-decker bus. He had them transported out to the Cambridgeshire Fen, where they are shot. And you can kind of see on the photograph on the cover, you can see in the distance is Ely Cathedral across the flatlands of the Fenlands, which is a beautiful cathedral in that region. But no, there wasn't going to be an illustration. No, it was old Storm. He was going to build the thing.
Unreal. Man.
And also, it's supposed to depict Syd Barrett because you've got they're two faces in profile, but also if you look at it face on full on, it forms a face in another kind of dimension. And it's been said that's supposed to represent Syd Barrett. I don't know whether that's the case, but I think at some point it got to the stage where Syd Barrett was always going to be somewhere on a Pink Floyd album.
Always has a presence, yeah. And Storm is missed as well. Syd Barrett passed in 2004, and Storm he passed too, man. He is sorely missed. He was from the era when those album covers mattered too. That was a great era.
I mean, I really love the story about how they made the album cover for obscured by clouds, which was actually an out-of-focus shot among the many shots that Storm had taken for. And apparently, I think it was a still from the film of one of these strange hippie travelers dangling upside down in a tree or something. But it was totally, it was a total mess. And I think they treated it some more. And that came out as the Obscured by Clouds cover. And apparently, Barbet Schroeder, the band hated it. And Barbet Schroeder accused the band of deliberately choosing a rough shot because they wanted, because they were bound to be wanting a presence of their own stuff. He got all very sort of personal and rather snippy about being done down by Floyd. Of course, the following year, out comes Dark Side of the Moon, which is one of the most iconic, magnificent album covers of all time. You put that up against Obscured by Clouds, and maybe Schroeder had a point. But
get back to the Division Bell. That was another commercial success. Goes number 1 in 10 countries, including the UK and US. And this has "What Do You Want From Me," "Wearing the Inside Out," which Rick sings lead on, "Keep Talking," "Take It Back." Uncut wrote in 2011, "The Dark Horse of the Floyd Canon." That's cool. How did you receive the album at first, and has your opinion changed over the years?
It hasn't changed. I liked it. I liked it better than Momentary Lapse because I liked the fact that they sort of seem to have left behind that very sharp, shiny 80s thing, which I think was a good thing. I resigned myself by then to figure they're never going to make another Sorts of the Secrets or another Echoes or a Dark Side. It's a better effort than Momentary Lapse. Production values aren't quite so pristine. Compressed drums have been discarded, and Rick Wright's back. Although Rick apparently he sort of unknowingly had to audition because apparently David Gilmour made a point of taping some of Rick's. Rick was messing around with keyboards, and without realizing it, David Gilmour taped it, and then listened back to the tapes later on and just declared Rick fit for. He could come back. He's fit. He's on song.
And those tapes would lead to the next and final Pink Floyd album, 2014's The Endless River.
Yes, which was another. Endless River was. I like it. I like it very much. Do I prefer it to the Division Bell? Possibly not, because I think the Division Bell does have High Hopes, which is stunning. I think brilliant, great Floyd anthem. Made for live performance. There's some more than decent music on it.
For David, though, it was a personal thing because Richard he passed away in 2006, I think. Was that the same year that
it's about then, yeah.
Oh, no, yeah. I'm sorry. He died in 2008.
2008, yes.
But David felt like there was some unfinished business regarding Richard's work. So this was a personal thing for him.
It was a personal thing, yeah. He knew that Floyd were always built on emotive feel. That was always the kind of thing about Floyd's music in the early days, was emotive feel. This was before all the big conceptual stuff came along, before Dark Side of the Moon, before Wish You Were Here and all the rest of it. And I think David Gilmour wanted to get back to that. And I think he, by and large, succeeds rather well. The Endless River is a good title for the album because you have this feeling that the band come in, because it's pretty much soundscaping all the way through. And it's as if they come in and it's like they're joining this stream that's already there. And, where it's come from, who knows? But they're coming in at the beginning of the record, they're joining this stream. At the end of the record, they leave the stream. But you kind of sense that stream's going on. Endless River is the perfect title for, and I think that played it perfectly. Gilmour said that he admitted it. He said he'd made a record for you to sit back on a beanbag and wear headphones to. And you don't get any more 1967 than that, really. Yeah. It was, in many ways, it was Floyd getting back to what they had started doing. And I think it's a beautiful album. I really do. It's lovely.
There's one thing I wanted to ask you, and this is so interesting on the Division Bell. At the very end of, at least on the CD, you hear somebody on the phone asking for somebody named Charlie. And then and then all of a sudden, you hear the person go, "Is Charlie there?" And then the phone hangs up and you hear somebody go, "Great." Do you know what that is?
Yeah, I think if I remember correctly, it's Steve O'Rourke, Floyd's manager, phoning Charlie Gilmore, he's David's stepson. It was a little bit of cinema verite there. It was a Zapperish sort of,
Richard Butterworth's Pink Floyd, every album, every song is out right now through Sonic Bond, and I hear it's doing well.
I did hear I'm rather pleased with myself about this. Apparently they sold out the first print run inside a couple of weeks.
I'm not surprised.
Yeah, I was rather pleased about that. But I think Stephen Lammy's got another print run going, so, I'm sure it's around.
By the way, we're recording this. It's about 6:30 when we started here, where I am in the U.S. 11:30 where you are. So I'm gonna let you go, so you can go. You can go to sleep.
Listen, Pink Floyd fans never sleep.
That's right. That's right.
We never have since 1968, so don't worry about that.
Richard, thank you so much, man. This was so fun to talk about.
That's great. Thank you, Eric. It was a privilege.
That's it. It's in the books.